Okay, so I have this video, or maybe I'll put the video links in my description, but I did pretty in-depth videos on the elements by 4 and the modes by 3 in a previous video. So I just want to do a quick sum up since I'm continuing the series, right, on what they mean. Not too in-depth, but just a quick glance back, at that information. Excuse me. So, what would, so first, let's just understand, right? What are the dials of mathematics, right? Every number incarnates the principle of 1, right? And how do we know this? Because every number is a number, right? In order to see a number, it's a number. And that is the principle of 1, the ability to incarnate the self in a unified form, right? Right? And so, then there is the dial of 2, right? And we could say 0 exists because if it was all 1, there would not be any relationship to C1, right? So 0 is sort of like the field around, like the representing the idea of alpha and omega, as if there is a 1, there is a naught, right? Which would balance each other out in the substance of the 1, right? So, but either way, so those would be present within every number, right? But then going into 2, now we see that numbers are either masculine or they're feminine, right? They're either odd or they're even, right? And one of the things to know with the dial of 2 is the only way to really see if something has an expression of masculinity or femininity is not to add it together first, right? Because if we add a number together and we're seeing where it is by 9, 9 isn't divisible by 2. So automatically we're giving masculinity, it's like patriarchal, right? If you want to put it that way. We're giving masculinity the upper hand, and now we're saying 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, right, are all masculine, where we only have 2, 4, 6, and 8 that are feminine, right? And so it's better to understand the 9 modally, right? And so before we break a number down, right, we want to keep intact what it is by 2, right? Or we want to break it down by 18, which would take a calculator, right? So it's better just to understand if it's odd or even and then see the modality. So we'll get, is it a masculine or feminine expression of the mode, right? But that's going a little too far. So now moving on to the dial of 3, right? This would be the modes, right? We know this as like the trinity: cardinal, fixed, and mutable, right? We have the masculine principle, completely creative, the mutable principle, completely receptive, and then the real, what is created in sort of the interweaving between the duality, right? The actual dynamic, right? That is instantiated between the two, right? That we can realize. So 1, cardinal; 2, fixed, right? And 3, mutable. And this would be the dial of 3, right? So now, once we get to 4 then, and we start expanding on this elementally, we're going to start seeing that this is just another representation of the dial of 2, because 4 is 2 by 2, right? So what happens is we have the, how are we going to see this? Because to me it looks like this one's 1, so to you it's got to be this one. So we're going to have the first realm, right, the spiritual realm, right, run, spiritual, whole, right, and then we have the 2 realm, the feminine, the corporeal, and the real, right, and then we have the masculine expression, right, fire, right, of the spiritual, and the feminine expression, water, of the spiritual. Then we have the masculine expression of the real, air, and the feminine expression of the real, earth, right? And these would be the 4 elements. So in respective order: fire, air, right? And then, fire, water, air, and earth, right? Fire, water, air, earth, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. So then we could even go further and start to understand the dial of 5, and this will bring us back to numbers, right? Because we know numbers are 5 by 2, right? And if we look at 5, I guess if we look at a body, right, if we picture a man, right, as a star with his hands spread out and his 2 feet on the ground, right, then we could picture it sort of as a 360, right? Because we always have the starting point the most masculine, right, and the ending point the most feminine, right? So we sort of have this most receptive principle in 5 and this most powerful creative principle in 1, right? Whereas we have the real principle in the middle in 3. So what I think this represents is sort of 1, we can correlate because 5 is half of the 10 planets, right? I think we can attribute some sort of planetary associations or a little bit of just elemental, right? Because we sort of have the realizing, right? And then we have the spiritual, right? And of the spiritual 1, right, we have the power, the creative personal force, right? And 5, we have the receptivity, the feminine elating nature, right? And then, yeah, in the 3, we have the actual realizing force, right? So if we start to think about then what would 2 be, right? Coming from this masculine perspective, but realizing, that would be like air, right? And then when we come from realizing to the feminine perspective, that would be like earth, right? And then we'd have water. So it would go like fire, air, real, earth, and water, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And so when we see that, how we can sort of, here, I'll draw a little star real quick. All right, so here's just the star, right? So we have fire starting off, right, like I said, and then we go to air, right, the real, the earth, and the water, right? And so, hold on, I'm gonna draw now planet. All right, and here are my planetary associations. So these are up for debate, right? Because, for example, when starting off with fire, I associate Mars and Pluto, right? And when we get to air, I associate Mercury and Uranus, right? But you may think a different way about the planet, so it's just to understand what these energies are, right? And where it is in relationship to the dial of 5, right? So, but basically this is how I associate it. And then 3 would be the real. So I associate that as the sun and the moon, because they are the most fixed and they're realizing, right? And yeah. The earth, I have Venus and Saturn, and the water, I have Neptune and Jupiter. So what this would mean is that every time 1 would on the dial of 10, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? 1 would be fire, right? 2 would be air, 3 would be real, 4 would be earth, 5 would be water, 6 would be fire, 8 would be air, or no, 6 would be fire, 7 would be air, 8 would be real, 9 would be earth, and 10 would be water, right? So that's a way that we can sort of picture then what a placement in mathematics would represent symbolically, right? And so understand what you would like, because one of the things we need to understand is maybe you don't want to interpret 2 and 7 as air, right? But understanding that it's in between the real and the creative spiritual is what you want to understand, and how the creative spiritual is giving into the real and what that would look like, right? So that is just something to keep in mind. But I think that those planets do, or at least my understanding of the planets do correlate, right? But there's more to understand astrologically, and maybe things will change as time goes on. But yeah, and then we would have compound dials like the dial of 6, right, which would be 3 by 2, and then 7 would actually be its own dial 2, which would almost be a little more traditional because we could incorporate all 7 planets. So let's try to bring that up and break that down. Hey, so here is the dial of 7, and this is just using the Chaldean order, right? Because I think it does have some great qualities to it that help us represent what's going on. So see Saturn, and this is the speed of the planets, right? Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. So at first glance, the first things that I notice are the sort of cold principles in Saturn and the Moon, right? And then the real and the steadiness and the centering of the Sun being in the center, right? 3 on this side, 3 on this side, and the Sun takes the center role, right? Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, right? Now, the next thing I notice is, obviously by order, these are the far out, right? So it kind of comes from this dark place, right, with the Saturn and the Moon, but it's starting to spiritualize because it's still far out. And Saturn has a spiritual element too, in that it's always pressing us to go forward, right? Where the Moon is dark, but it sort of has that corporeal, and we could recede into it, right? But we could never truly, I feel like, reach a pinnacle, or else we don't really understand what that sort of represents in the whole process of reaching towards, right? But either way, so we start with the spiritual elements of Jupiter and Mars, and then we come to this real shift, right? And then it goes to Venus and Mercury, right? Where we start to bring in the more real components, right? So, this is just interesting. So this would be like by 7, right? And this would, I feel like, be a great star to understand and look more depth into when we talk about lunar stuff, because 28 is 4 sevens, right? And 28 is a very lunar number in just relationship with the sun, moon, and earth, right? Because it takes 28 days on average for the moon to go around and do its thing. So yeah, a little bit, I guess, more about this is, it's just interesting. It does seem like Saturn, right, the sun and the moon create their own trinity, and they don't really have a masculine or femininity, whereas when we go through this star, we almost start to see Jupiter is more feminine and Mars is more masculine, and then Venus is more feminine and Mercury is more masculine, like going round, right? So just some things to bring up. And so, but yeah, basically to start then, understanding too the dial of 7 and what these would represent by the 7 planets, is I do think there's a little more to do to study how this would actually come out, right? Because I do think that we could use the 7 traditional planets when it comes down to the dial of 7, but I think that I almost feel like if we start with the sun, right, and then the 4th point is Saturn and the most real, that would kind of make sense, right? And still ending with the moon, right? And sort of figuring out how that would look, right? And like, because I don't want to mess with the order too much and make it like skewed, right? But I do want to figure out how to represent 7 accurately, because the things we would know is it would sort of be 2 sets of cardinal fixed mutable, or at least 3 on each side, and then there would be one that stands out as a centering principle, right? So I think it almost does make sense, right? Because it's almost like, I think what we should take here is that these are the spiritual, and Saturn represents this cardinality, and it's at the beginning, right? And these are sort of the close in, and moon represents the mutability, which is what we can give ourselves to, right? And then the sun is this middle realization. So then it's just to understand that these are the giving force, and how we're personally giving, how we're realizing that, and just how we give in, right? And these are the spiritualizing force on how we're personally spiritual, realizing that, and then just letting that work through us, right? So, so the Planetary Associations would be something that would be fun to discuss, but that would be the dial of 7, right? Because every prime number, right, 8 would just be something that we could easily figure out, because it would be 2 by 4, right? And we already know what those numbers mean. Whereas once we get to, say, 11, now we have to start to understand, okay, now it would be 4, almost elemental, or no, it would be 5 by 5 on each side, right? So it'd almost be like each half would have a pinnacle, right, of 3. 1, 2, 3, right, 4, 5, and then the 6th would be the centering principle, and then 7, 8, 9 would be another pinnacle, 10, 11, right? And it would create like its own star, right? And we have to understand each star and its references by itself, right? But yeah, so this was just a little look into starting to understand now with the mathematical principles of dials how we can get a little bit of zodiacal information, right? And I like to use the dial of 10 because I see it as a little more clear cut, and it's already baked in mathematics, and as well as the modes, right? And once we get to 20, so is elements, right? Because 10 isn't quite, or when we get to 100, right? Because 10 isn't quite divisible by 4, but 100 is. So mathematics easily allow us to get a glimpse of the element, the mode, and the planetary association, which gives us a great deal of information in terms of, say, like just information, yeah, symbolic placement, and astrological alignment. So, hey, bubbling.